Support for your public radio station comes from our members and from the Golisano Foundation, supporting Move to Include programming on WXXI and working with the community to lead change toward the inclusion of people with intellectual and physical disabilities. Share your thoughts at movetoinclude.org.
From WXXI News, this is Connections, co-hosting with my colleague Sarah Abamonte. I'm Evan Dawson. Our connection this hour was made over the past month or so when the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., began talking more often about autism. Now, for years, Kennedy has recycled false statements about autism and vaccines. In the past couple of weeks, he's been making the case that some presentations of autism are essentially new to our society in recent decades and therefore have to be linked to some kind of environmental or medical intervention. I want to listen to what RFK Jr. said last week on Fox News talking to Sean Hannity.
This is an individual tragedy as well. Autism destroys families. More importantly, it destroys our greatest resource, which are our children. These are children who should not be suffering like this. These are kids who, many of them were fully functional and regressed because of some environmental exposure into autism when they're 2 years old. And these are kids who will never pay taxes. They'll never hold a job. They'll never play baseball. They'll never write a poem. They'll never go out on a date. Many of them will never use a toilet unassisted. And we have to recognize we are doing this to our children, and we need to put an end to it.
And let me also say, that's Kennedy making some national statements. I want to listen to what he said to Sean Hannity on Fox News as well about how he sees, in his view, a change in autism throughout his lifetime.
Anybody with common sense, Sean, would notice that because the autism, this epidemic is only happening in our children. It's not happening in people our age. And if it was better recognition, you'd see it in 70-year-old men. And I'll say this, I want to be very careful when I say it because I've never seen a person with full-blown autism. I've seen many people with Asperger's and, on the spectrum who are my age. I've never seen anybody with full-blown autism. That means nonverbal, non-toilet trained, etc. You don't see these people walking around a mall because they don't exist in our age. Or they're very, very rare. They do exist, but they're rare, so rare that I've never seen one.
Experts in the field have repeatedly tried to explain to Kennedy that autism is not new. What has changed is how effective clinicians have become in identifying autism. As Stat News recently explained, there is no simple test for autism, so diagnosing it requires extensive training and observational techniques. But Kennedy isn't buying it. He wants new studies to focus on vaccines, even though the possible connection between vaccines and autism has been repeatedly debunked. And after meeting recently with the National Institutes of Health, the NIH floated the idea of creating a national autism registry to track Americans with an autism diagnosis.
Now, this week, Kennedy's office walked back that idea, but they say that Kennedy does want a lot more research. Meanwhile, Kennedy's remarks about the effects of autism has provoked a wide range of passionate responses. Many have come from families who were outraged. You're going to hear some of their voices today. Some of the response comes from parents who said that Kennedy's comments resonated with them in a way. The National Council on Severe Autism says people with debilitating autism should not be ignored, and their lives are very different from people who might be described as high-functioning on the autism spectrum. So there's a lot to talk about this hour, and I want to welcome our guests. Welcome back to the program, Dylan Daylor, who is an autistic self-advocate. Been a little while. Nice to see you back here. Thanks for being here.
Nice to see you again, Evan.
Next to Dylan is Jerry Lynn Sparks, and someone who works in autism acceptance, appreciation, awareness, and inclusion as an advocate for nearly 30 years, the proud mother of a son with autism and his 3 siblings, of course. Yes. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you for having me.
And welcome to Dr. Laura Silverman, Associate Professor and Clinical Child Psychologist in the Division of Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics at the University of Rochester Medical Center. Dr. Silverman, thank you for being on the program.
Thanks for having me.
we're going to start by asking all 3 of our guests if they want to share some initial reactions in general to some of what the Secretary of HHS has been saying in the last month. I'll start with Dylan Daylor. What do you make of what you heard?
Oh boy, kicking it off. I don't think that this is anything different than what Kennedy has been saying in the past. He's always been a charlatan and a demagogue who uses autism as a cudgel to advance his own beliefs that are constantly misinformed. The only difference now is that he actually has the power of the government, which is, I think, as I was saying before the program, why I was so afraid when he was picked. He was a bad choice for Health and Human Services.
Jerry Lynn Sparks?
My first reaction was to send everybody I know an expletive-laden text.
I got one of those.
How angry I was that my son was being described as a tragedy, a burden. The first thing that RFK led with was, these people will never pay taxes. I'm like, wow, tell us where you really think. You know, does Amazon pay taxes? Does Elon Musk pay taxes? Is the measure of someone's worth whether or not they pay taxes? And I have not been able to get over the fact that the person chosen for the Secretary of Health and Human Services is not only misguided, but against the scientific principles. Correlation is not causation, and you have to follow where the evidence leads, and he's just shooting from the hip. That is a dangerous recipe for someone to be Secretary of Health and Human Services.
Dr. Silverman.
Yeah, my initial response is that he talks about not seeing adults with autism, but I also feel like he hasn't seen children with autism, because when I hear his description, it's really clear to me that he doesn't see the value in the people who have autism, and he's not aware of the fact that autism is a spectrum and that there's a wide variety of people with different abilities. I also would I think it would be helpful for him to think about his family history, because he has an aunt who had a developmental disability, and one of his other aunts saw the value in people with developmental disabilities, and she founded the Special Olympics. And as a result of that, people with autism and other disabilities now are able to shine and do things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So I would invite him to think about potential rather than deficit, and to think about what ways can government really support this community so that they can be successful.
You know, Sarah and I, we work in an organization where when we have this microphone, all of our colleagues, we take it very seriously, and we try to be as fair as we can. And I want to tell listeners, if you want to weigh in on any of this, no matter where you are and what RFK Jr. has said, or these issues, I want you to know that you can do that. It's 844-295-TALK. It's toll free. 844-295-8255. 263-WXXI if you call from Rochester. 263-9994. You can email the program, connections@wxxi.org. You can join the chat if you're watching on YouTube, on the WXXI News YouTube channel. But Sarah, this is a hard one because, we are not necessarily we're not in advocacy. We're trying to, in this setting especially, trying to be good stewards of public conversation, journalism, good discourse. And someone is going to accuse me of just being, some kind of loaded political hack. And I don't want to be that. But I also look at this and say, to Dylan's point, this is the Secretary of HHS. This is someone who is no longer an activist or someone kind of peddling in conspiratorial online fever swamps. This is someone with a lot of power. How should we be talking about we have to be direct, right? When the evidence is direct.
We do. And I think it's looking at the science and looking at the data. And, to Jerry's point, causation is not correlation. And I think that's something we really need to bring back into our discourse a little bit. I think, I'm biased because I took research methods a lot as an undergrad and a graduate, and I like to get my money's worth. So
it's helped you out well in your career?
It has. And also to Dr. Silverman's point, and we talked about this in the first hour, Evan, it's the lived experience. You want people at the table who have, whether it's, they have autism themselves like Dylan, or they are a parent like Jerry, or they're studying it like Dr. Silverman. These are the voices you want around the table. And I think anyone, but particularly someone who's in a position like Secretary of HHS, if you come to that table with a little bit of humility and say, look, I have questions, I don't know what I don't know, and I need you to be sharing what your experience and your information and your data is with me. I think we could all benefit from that perspective.
To that point, Dr. Silverman, when the secretary says, we're going to get an answer on what causes autism, I want to read some of what the Autism Society of America said about that, because Sarah is talking about an empirical approach that looks at the data wherever it leads you and then understands how to interpret data. That's different than saying, I got a feeling it's vaccines, and we're going to find out. We're going to go get it. We're going to go get that information, even though
Confirmation bias.
it's been studied. Yeah, motivated reasoning. So this is a response from the Autism Society of America to the comments that Kennedy has made, saying that they will find the cause of autism through new research. They say, quote, "The Autism Society of America finds the administration's claim that we will know what has caused the autism epidemic and will be able to eliminate those exposures to be harmful, misleading, and unrealistic. Autism is a complex developmental disability shaped by genetic, biological, and environmental factors. It is neither a chronic illness nor a contagion that qualifies harmful language like epidemic, and to do so is both inaccurate and stigmatizing. Autistic individuals are human beings who deserve dignity, respect, and equitable civil rights. Leading disability organizations, the scientific community, and medical experts agree more rigorous science-based research is necessary, not speculation, oversimplified timelines, or diminished transparency." And they also include a section in their statement on the dangers of misinformation and debunked theories, in which they say, claims that autism is solely caused by environmental exposures, parenting styles, or vaccines not only lacks scientific evidence, but are incredibly irresponsible. End quote. What do you make of their statements there?
I think if there was an easy answer, we would already know it. So there have been decades of research on this already, and thousands of researchers who've looked into what causes autism. So I think what we know so far is that there's a significant genetic component to autism. There are also other factors that contribute to a higher likelihood of autism, especially if you have a genetic likelihood. So, for example, there could be some things in the environment. There has been research on things like pesticides, pollution, aspects of the family and the prenatal environment. So parental age at conception, a higher parental age. And I think there's complexity there. So I recognize people don't like uncertainty, but I think that's something that you have to sit with here because there is no easy answer. And I also think the research community would love to do research into aspects of environmental exposures as long as there's an understanding of everything that we know so far. So how would you take that data and really integrate it with what we know about biology, genetics, and other factors?
And I think if Kennedy were here, part of what he would say is, well, I didn't notice it when I was growing up. There wasn't, in his words, severe autism when I was growing up. Something has changed. Is it fair to say in any way that autism is new, that it only really is a recent phenomenon, that it wasn't around 50, 70 years ago?
So I think it has changed. When he was a kid, the definition of autism that exists now within our diagnostic systems didn't exist when he was a kid.
So that's what's changed.
Yeah, that's a big part of what's changed. It doesn't mean that people who had the same condition that's called autism didn't exist back then. It just means that we didn't call it autism and we didn't know about it the way we know about it now. It also means that there was different policy in place so that people weren't identified and there weren't necessarily supports in place for them. So people weren't looking for an autism diagnosis, partially because the science wasn't there yet, but also because there weren't reasons to do so. So now in schools, you can get an autism classification, which leads to lots of supports so that your child can be successful. That didn't exist back then.
But Kennedy is 71 years old, and part of what he's saying is when he was in his 20s in the 70s, he didn't notice people with the conditions that we call autism. Is that compelling to you?
I mean, I think a lot has changed since then. So the people that he's thinking about were probably institutionalized back then. And we have a
Including his
very
aunt.
different system now.
Yes, yeah.
You know, Rosemary Kennedy,
Yep.
his aunt, was institutionalized. They tried an experimental treatment on her when she was 22, a lobotomy, and it ended up being a disaster, and they sent her away to another state. I think Wisconsin, I believe it was.
We could spend a whole 2 hours on that alone.
Institutionalization
Yeah.
and the history in this
Absolutely,
country.
absolutely, and it's recent history. You know, we talk about Kennedy being in his 70s, but so are a lot of these other people. This is very, very recent American history, and you know, we could delve back into it.
One thing I would like to say is the thing that really enrages me about RFK is he's saying, well, if I don't see it, it doesn't exist. So I am the arbiter of all information. And he needs to get out of his bubble more. Like, go out into different parts of the country. Go visit hospitals. Go to Strong Hospital. Invite him. Strong Hospital, invite him here. Let's show him what he isn't seeing. I don't even think that he has ill intent with saying that. I think he's just got that much tunnel vision and arrogance.
I don't know about his intent, and I try not to ascribe ill intent.
Yeah.
I don't think most people lie in bed at night thinking, ha, I'm a bad person.
Right.
I got away with it. I think most people think they're on the right side
Yes.
of things. He has been hearing from people like Dr. Silverman for years. And at some point, I'm wondering why that hasn't registered.
I thought about that too. I think two things. I do think it's arrogance. And I also think that there is this tendency that I've seen in my personal life where people don't want to feel that anything in their family caused what he deems a tragedy. They were looking for something to blame instead of saying, you know what, autism is a different way of being. It's always been here. They think that Socrates probably had autism. If you were to look at the characteristics and things that we know, that's way before vaccines, way before food dyes, way before air pollution, way before all these things that they're saying are causing epigenetic changes. And the thing I would say about epigenetic changes is you still have to have the predisposition for the epigenetic change to act on.
So let's do this here. I want to address a couple of the ripples that have kind of come out of the last month with our guests, and then we're going to open it up to some of your feedback, listeners. But the first of those is very consistently I saw people responding to RFK's comments by basically saying, do we have too broad a spectrum? You know, Dylan, this is gonna be clumsy, okay? Do you mind if I say something clumsy?
I don't mind.
You don't mind clumsy?
That's
Okay.
that's what it's for.
So most of my interactions with Dylan, probably the first time was about your autism, but probably every time since then, before today, has been about politics.
Yeah.
That you're someone who has done a lot of work in politics. I think you're a very insightful person. I love talking to you, kind of nerding out with you about it. Dylan's like on the short list of people, like when big political stories, like who are we going to get really thoughtful? Like Dylan's on that list. And I don't know if I had not talked to you first about your autism, that I would have thought, hey, there's somebody with autism. I don't know what that means about me. I don't know what it means about society, but I don't know that I would have identified that. And I want to ask you, how does autism, what does it mean for you to have autism?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is the knowledge that my diagnosis didn't come late. It came when I was 8. I got it from the University of Rochester. But I think back then it was to a level more noticeable. Even in school, they noticed I was engaging in activities that the average child did not. I didn't really play with my classmates. I played next to my classmates, something closer to what we would describe as parallel play. As I got older, it is less noticeable immediately. However, the frustration for me comes in. I am still not great at reading social cues. I'm kind of guessing my way through a situation. I still have very strong reactions to sensory input, but I have also had to do a lot of work to kind of tone down my reaction to that. And I would say the fact that I can talk about politics, there's a reason why, and it's because I spend a lot of time reading about politics. It is what one would describe as my special interest.
Okay.
I can Robert Kennedy said that autistic people don't date. I can tell you that my exes have complained that I talk way. Dylan, please put down the computer. Stop drawing redistricting maps. It is our date night. You know, it has
Political
happened.
widows.
Yeah. You know, I apologize for all my exes who have had to make that complaint. But there are these moments where I do not think about others. I actually have to think in my head, what is this other person thinking? That does not come naturally to me.
Okay. Do you struggle with sarcasm, understanding sarcasm?
Oh yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's my father said when I actually wrote my college admissions essay on this. I was so bad at it for so long. He said one year, maybe Santa will bring you a sense of humor for Christmas.
Whoa.
It sounds worse than it is, because I think I was making the same "why did the hamster cross the road to get to the ham?" because I thought that was hilarious. And I was 10, and I was a little bit behind developmentally with my ability to make jokes. And I still miss it a lot, but I think that it's a lot easier now.
So when you talk about what RFK said about some people with autism will never have a date, they'll never pay taxes, they'll never be able to take care of themselves. What RFK would say is that, in fairness, he was talking about people like Jerry's son, not about Dylan. And that the argument that I'm hearing from some observers is this spectrum is so broad that Dylan and Jerry's son should not be given the same diagnosis, that it's a different thing, that they have different needs. What do you think of that, Jerry?
Are there different levels, severity of depression? Are there different severity levels of anxiety? You can have a generalized anxiety disorder. You can have one that makes you debilitated. I think that the fact that it is a spectrum is accurate. Dylan and Jared, my son's name's Jared, he's 27, have some challenges that are similar. They overlap. The unique focus on something to the point of being not able to stop thinking about it we can't go someplace sometimes because he just will not stop focusing on something. At perseveration, I think is the clinical term. And I don't know about Dylan, but my son, and I have two other sons who are not technically autistic like my son Jared is, but they all had language delays. Speech was really difficult for them. They had delayed toileting, and yet you wouldn't put my sons in the same category, with the same mother, same father. And yet I think that, if they were here today, my two older sons who are classified as typically developing, probably if they were born today would be considered on the spectrum. So I think it's accurate, and I think that, again, it's one-sidedness on RFK's part, where he just absolutely cannot see nuance. He cannot see anything except his own predilection. He just cannot see it.
And this is where I worry, Sarah Abamonte, that when we try to do the work that we do at XXI, when everything gets politically charged, it feels like you got to pick a side, and whatever side you're on, then you're going to lose half your audience. And I don't want to live in that world. I want to be able to say, it does not matter to me where an idea comes from. If it's a good idea, it's valuable. It doesn't matter what political team or political tribe it comes from. It doesn't matter who is right or wrong here, but it feels so charged. And I think the work gets harder when everything feels so loaded.
I think so too. Even just looking back a couple of years ago, we were in a different situation culturally, politically. Disability was seen as one of those bipartisan issues that we could all get together on. And now you are seeing it more politicized, and it's being weaponized in a way that I don't think we've seen necessarily in the same way in the past. But for us here, our work at XXI and with Move to Include is really to bring all of these voices in and to prominently feature and uplift the folks in our community and the organizations in our community that are doing the work, like URMC, and then having folks like Dylan and Jerry come and share their personal experience and getting those voices around the table. Because I think a lot of times, even though we talk about the statistics of general disability overall, 1 in 4 American adults identify as having a disability. That's the latest CDC statistic, and it's only going to increase as we are an aging population. Things like you were saying, Dr. Silverman, with like advanced maternal age and things like that, these statistics are only going to go up. So it is kind of rare for folks to not have a lived experience, whether direct lived experience or with a family or a loved one of disability. But that being said, that doesn't always, to Jerry's point, that doesn't always give you the wider breadth of experience. And so what we try to do is bring as many voices, as many experiences, as many opportunities for folks to tell their own stories to the table. And then, I think we have a really educated and thoughtful audience that's going to take that information and apply it to their own life and say, how does this change my perspective? Is this something I want to get involved in? Should I talk to the folks around me? The vast majority of people with disabilities are like myself. I have a non-apparent or invisible disability. And if I were to walk into a room, to your point about Dylan, like you may not immediately clock it as someone with a disability. And I think that's true for a lot of folks. So interrogating and thinking about who is in their network and their social circle that they encounter every day, and having a little bit of curiosity and grace.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And I'll give you an example of how I think what ends up happening when we become overly politicized. I can understand intellectually the argument. That's why I asked the question, is the spectrum too broad? Is a Dylan Daler, maybe Dylan can talk about his life and his experiences, but should the diagnosis be different than someone like Jared? I can understand where people might feel like the answer should be yes, or why it would be yes. Although I find Jerry's points pretty compelling. There's different degrees of ankle sprain. There's different degrees of depression. So I get that. The problem is, instead of an open discourse and a give and take about that, like, can we do it better? Should we compartmentalize more? And should we, what we end up having is like, well, now it's broader than it used to be. And it used to be 1 in 100, and then it was 1 in 88, and it was 1 in 76. And guess what that means? It's probably vaccines. Like, that's where it goes. It just doesn't need to go to these places.
Well, can I say something about vaccines? I know vaccines that they're talking about, the MMR, was released in the 1960s. Leo Kanner described autism in the 1940s. 20-year difference there. I went to a family reunion with my ex-husband. Brilliant people, brilliant. And there was people there that today would be diagnosed, but a diagnosis didn't exist back then. This is like 30 years ago, so before I even had my son. Because I went to that reunion when he was diagnosed, I'm like, I get it. And he was the first in the family to actually be diagnosed. And then those older people started going, this explains a lot of the things that I don't understand about me. Mm-hmm. So just wanted to say, to that. But the other thing I would say, that I did not cause my son's autism. And RFK is causing people like my son. Jared heard something about this. And I remember when he was maybe 11, he saw something about autism. And I said, well, Jared, this is, something that you have. He goes, I have autism? It was just like a shock. But the messaging that we're saying, that the autism is a tragedy, my son is internalizing that, whether or not he can verbalize that or not. And I'm sure that you also see that, Dr. Silverman, in your clinic.
Yeah, I'm seeing that a lot. And we're getting a lot of calls in clinic about the messaging that's been coming out from Washington. And, just an example of that is there's been talk about an autism registry that's come up. We've been getting a lot of parents calling in with concerns about whether they'll end up on that autism registry. And also, we're starting to see people who are making the decision to forgo care. So they're not getting a diagnosis that they may otherwise get out of fear. And I think that that's where, within the research world, we know that early intensive intervention is one of the best indicators of success and improvement throughout life. So if messaging like that is really getting in the way of seeing a child develop to their fullest potential, that's a concern clinically.
Yeah, and just in terms of the registry, my understanding of the where things are now is that first came up because RFK met with Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who is the head of the NIH now, and Bhattacharya, in a meeting with the NIH board, said, we're going to look into creating an autism registry. NIH and HHS staff both have come out in the last few days and walked back and said, we're not doing a registry. Just so in case people are hearing that. My understanding is right now that's off the books. I can't speak for next week or next month. I know things change pretty quickly in this administration. My understanding is right now that is not planned here. One other point before I get to some listener feedback here. I do want to ask you, Jerry, a little bit about what I was reading in a piece in Newsweek. So Mark Kendall is a parent who defended Kennedy to an extent. He's the California chair of the National Council on Severe Autism. And he wrote a piece titled, "I Have a Child with Severe Autism. RFK Jr. Gets One Thing Right About It." He writes, quote, "Many parents of children with severe autism like myself see things differently. While I find Kennedy's anti-vaccine views deeply troubling, I see just as much danger from those who ignore or minimize the existence of people with severe autism, many of whom suffer from seizures, catatonia, profound communication impairments, and other issues. Kennedy's aghast critics typically did not acknowledge the daily realities of the more than 25% of the autism population with the severe form the secretary was referring to. Also missing was a call for additional research to alleviate dangers such as self-injurious behaviors, or for more societal help with providing the lifetime 24/7 support those with severe autism typically need. This is a form of disability denial, a growing movement promoting the notion that autism is simply a way of being. This worldview, if taken to the extreme, attributes any difficulties people with autism face purely to the way society is set up, instead of to the disability itself, and downplays or dismisses problems that don't fit within its framework," end quote. What do you think, Jen?
So every time you said the word severe, it felt like a stab to my heart. My son is not severe. My son has, and I know you didn't mean that you're just reading.
Yeah,
you're just reading.
and I have to tell you, Jerry, I'm trying to use terminology that is correct
There's so much
and kind.
Well, so Autism Speaks split from the Autism Science Foundation over the verbiage that they use for that very reason. So I tend to use classic autism to describe my son because I don't like the word severe to describe who he is as a human being. Jared is not severe. And so that is a word that has weight behind it. So I personally do not like that use. I know that they used to have the phrase Asperger's, but we took that away for lots of historical reasons. Mm-hmm. I actually found it helpful back then before I knew the historical negativity surrounding, the connotations, because it told me that maybe there are some people that I could let them walk to the store by themselves. I would never let my son Jared walk to the store by himself. When I was first into the world of autism, I used to be frustrated when I would go to some of the parents groups. It was called Unifeet, I think, before it was Autism Up. And Evan, you actually had me on your show that many years ago. And I remember talking to one of the parents here, and they were describing how hard it was for their child to walk to school by themselves. And I was like, walk to school by themselves? What are they talking about? And then I felt resentful that the funding, which was limited, was going to people that could walk to school. And now I get it. I have been educated. I have learned that even though their challenges are different than my son's, they're not any less legitimate. So I think that there's a lot of different perspectives here, even within Autism Up. I every time I log in, I get upset by something someone thinks because we're all parents just trying to figure this out. And I don't want to make it political. I want to make it less harmful to my son and people like Dylan. I want to make it equitable, but I also want to be able to have my voice heard because my son Jared cannot speak for himself. And I hope that we can continue, including, you've said before, nothing about us without us. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I so appreciate the fact that you do that. But even within the autism community, we still haven't landed on the right terminology.
Well, and so let me ask Dr. Silverman a little bit about when you see a parent like Kendall who writes that piece for Newsweek saying, my son he uses the term severe autism, and he's worried that there is kind of an erasure or an ignoring of the challenge. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I would say there is it is a spectrum, and kids range and adults range from the kind of child that you described in what you read all the way to someone like Dylan, who we have today here. And I think clinically, when you diagnose with someone with autism, within the system we have now, the way that we talk about it isn't necessarily severity, it's levels of support. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there are 3 levels of support that are kind of designated, and we really think more broadly about the person in front of us and what their needs are in the moment. And that level of support may also change over time. Mm-hmm. But in response to what you just asked, I do think that there is a more silent minority of people with autism who need a lot more support. And they're not always as apparent, especially around policy, around programming. They have higher needs. And I do think that there should be more of a focus on them as well.
So after we take our only break, and this is going to be the only break of the hour, I'll work in some feedback from listeners as we talk about autism, what people with autism need, what the research community is working on, and maybe how that contrasts in a way with what literally national leadership from HHS has been saying for the last month about it, and why in some ways that makes things more difficult, both for researchers and for individuals and families. So we'll come right back with our guests. You just heard Dr. Laura Silverman, who's an associate professor and clinical child psychologist in the Division of Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics at the University of Rochester Medical Center. Dylan Daler is here, who's an autistic self-advocate. Jerry Lynn Sparks is a mom, a proud mom of a son who's 27 now, and her son Jared has classic autism, and she's talking about that, the family and her experience as well. Your feedback on the other side of this break.
Support for your public radio station comes from our members and from 2 Point Capital Management, an investment firm working with clients to create custom portfolios of stocks and bonds. 2 Point is dedicated to helping people manage financial risk in good times and bad. More at 2pointcapital.com. Something Jerry said right before we came back, I just want to touch on and ask Jerry and Dylan about before, and then I'm going to read some of your emails. Dylan told you a little bit about how sometimes communication and understanding social cues can be a challenge for you, and you're really self-aware about it, and I know you work on it. For Jerry's son, Jared doesn't speak for himself, but Jerry, just reading your posts over the years, I mean, he communicates in pretty interesting ways that you certainly know him better. But in general, I just want you to tell the audience a little bit of what it's like when someone who you love and care about is struggling to be understood.
So Jared couldn't speak until he was 4.5 years old, and he had little utterances before that. So I think maybe like one-word phrases, but he couldn't put sentences together. And he didn't call me mommy until he's 4.5 years old. And I remember the day it happened, we were in the mudroom, and he had Magnadoodle. He carried it with him everywhere, and I thought it was a fixation. I didn't realize until that moment. I drew a stick figure of a person, and I pointed to it, and I pointed to me. I said, "Mommy," and I did this over and over. The whole day, I was like obsessed. Maybe my form of autism contribution there. I was obsessed, and by the end of the day, he had gotten the connection. Oh, mommy is her, and that seemed to open a floodgate for him, and he began putting sentences together. But he cannot speak in terms of, analogies. Like, it would be very difficult for him to do an analogy. So he can tell me if I really drill down, Evan, I don't feel well, but he doesn't like to admit he doesn't feel well. So when he has been very, very sick, we've ended up in the hospital because he cannot convey to me, I have a fever, or I have a stomach ache, I have a broken bone. He cannot tell us when he has a broken bone. He had an abscessed tooth. He didn't tell us. Like, it is dangerous, his lack of communication of the things that he feels. He can say, I love Taylor Swift. I want to go to the concert. I love Tom Cruise movies. Or every night he says, Mom, can we have a history lesson? So for things he really, really likes at that kind of, the 5-year-old I want level, he is very able to do that. And he introduces me everywhere we go to every stranger. Hi, this is Jerry Lynn Sparks, my mom. Do you know her? So he can say stuff like that, and he wants to connect, really wants to connect. But when it comes to actually advocating, he can't do that. And so what I find is when RFK says stuff like that, who's going to advocate for Jared when I'm gone? And thank God for my daughter Madison. She is such a little warrior, but not everybody has a mom and a Madison. And my son Grant would step up. It worries me so much when we've got government policies spreading these falsehoods that actually have life and death implications. And I mean that seriously. These are real life consequences here.
So what would you tell the Secretary of HHS if you really thought he would listen to you about what would make Jared's life better?
come spend a day with Jared. Go to Strong Hospital. Autism Up, invite him here. I don't think he is a horrible human being. I don't know him. But like you, I don't want to ascribe negative things to people. I think he is very arrogant. And the way you cure arrogance, hopefully, is by experience, that lived experience. He needs to get out of his, Cape Cod bubble. He needs to come and spend some time with people in the trenches. And I don't think that could be an experience that you can't come away changed by.
So Dylan, your life is very different than Jared, but you talked about, sometimes communication being an issue. Do you get better with studying that? I mean, do you feel like you're more capable now at picking up on cues and communicating more effectively?
Yeah, I mean, I think most autistic people who are diagnosed at a certain age remember doing social stories and literally having read out to you, like, this is how you interact. And I think sometimes, like, I often joke, sometimes you can tell when somebody is still using their social. I can always tell when somebody's still using their social stories. I will still fail a pragmatic language test, though, because, and I can remember to this day the pragmatic language test that was given to me, and the problem with the answers of my questions was they would ask me, what should this person do? And I would say, I would do this. I cannot necessarily process in this situation, if I was this person, I would do this.
Can that improve with time?
Yes and no. It will never come naturally.
Okay.
If I put work into thinking about it, yeah, I can say to some degree what somebody else might do. But if we're in a test situation where the expectation is that it's going to come in a natural way, I will always default back to, I would do this.
Does it require more energy for you to try to figure out?
Oh, I'm exhausted at the end of the day.
You're exhausted.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? I mean, just the things that I might take for granted, you're really putting a lot of work in, but that's going to drain you.
Yeah.
That's really.
We use social stories for Jared. Those were extremely helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do they still use social stories?
Sometimes.
Yeah. I think adults can use social stories. I think RFK needs a social story. I do.
Well, let me see what Rich says in Rochester on the phone. Hey, Rich, go ahead.
Hey, Evan, how are you doing?
Good, sir.
There's several things, but the first thing about RFK, my worry about RFK is this. RFK doesn't want to learn. He wants to be right. When you want to be right versus I want to learn and I want to grow and I want to understand, you will get things horribly wrong. Another thing is you have said several times, I don't want to make this political. But it's already political. These are the things we can't avoid. We got to stop saying we don't want to make it political, and we have to deal with it at a political level. This is the bottom line. We can't avoid that. And if we keep saying we don't want to make this political, I don't know where we go. We're not going to get anywhere. These are unfortunately these are the hard realities that we have to deal with.
Rich, I think
with this stuff.
I think your framing is really smart in that you point out there's a difference between wanting to learn and wanting to be right. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons that when we talked about the recent Canadian election yesterday, one of the reasons that I pulled the sound that I did from Prime Minister Carney's Monday night election victory speech, I pulled it about humility. And he talked about how wrong he is going to be and how often wrong he is. He's the recently elected prime minister of a country, not a state, a country. Not a state, Dylan Daler. See, that was for you, Dylan. That was for the political junkie on the table.
Prime minister, not a governor.
But I mean, it was pretty remarkable to hear someone say, I'm going to be wrong and I'm going to learn. And modern team sport politics, and our guests have a lot of experience. I mean, Jerry's talking about her family. Jerry's off and on talking about having been a congressional press secretary. And you've been in the trenches with people who are addicted to being right, no matter the circumstances.
That is so true.
And when that becomes a calculus, not just for politics, but for health, for research, for whether you vaccinate, for how we describe human beings, for whether we fund support services, and you have to be right, doesn't matter what the evidence tells you, that's a different level of danger. And I think Rich's point is a really good one. And so when I say I don't want it to be political, that's kind of what I mean, Rich, is that I think politics has pushed us in this direction where people have to, their team must be right. You can't do what Mark Carney said. You can't say, I was wrong. We're going to learn from this. Because then they all say, gotcha. See, this guy's not trustable. This woman is wrong all the time. And that's not a healthy place to be. I want to be able to be wrong. I'm wrong all the time. All the time. But I think there's a social cost and a political cost in this arena to being wrong. And I don't think that's healthy. And that's what I mean when I say I want to get the politics out and just say, what does the research tell us? What does Dr. Silverman know? Like, what are your colleagues telling us? What's the latest study show? But then here's what happens. Here's an email from, where was Tim's? Tim emailed to say, why are you ignoring studies that link autism to vaccines? I'm not ignoring studies, Tim. I promise you I'm not. If there's a brand new study tomorrow that was like, whoa, we were wrong. We've got it. Would you want to know that, Dr. Silverman?
Of course.
Even
Yeah.
even if it contradicted our previous understandings?
I think that's how scientific progress happens.
Yes.
But let me say this. So if vaccines were to be found in a study to cause that, how do you explain all the people back in 350 BCE? How do you explain the people in the wild boy in the French woods? I forgot his name, but in the 17 or 1800s, there are people with autism. We just didn't call it that back then. There were no vaccines. So that's what I would always say. Correlation is not causation.
But to be clear, I'm going to let Dr. Silverman respond to Tim's email. I promise you, Sarah and I are not trying to ignore studies.
Nope.
I would want to know every piece of data. And there has been a lot of study about this. Dr. Silverman, you want to just explain? I'm not trying to condescend here.
No,
I'm trying,
I think that the scientific community feels like there has been ample evidence showing that there's not a link between vaccines and autism. And these are not small studies. So there have been large population-based studies in European countries where there is population-based medicine. So they have thousands of people who have been vaccinated and not vaccinated, and they can look at the rates of autism across those cohorts of people, and they can see that there's no difference in the rates of autism. And so it's not just one study. There's a whole body of literature. So I think that people feel fairly confident about that at this point.
Would you want to know, Dylan?
I would want to know, but I don't necessarily. I mean, here's the thing that I would like to point out.
Yeah.
And I often think about this is the reminder, like, I would rather be vaccinated for measles, mumps, and rubella, even if there actually was a risk, which there is not a risk of becoming autistic. The research is pretty borne out on this. I would rather have the chance of not dying than the chance of not being autistic. I think that it is the language that RFK Jr. has pushed, that it is worse off to be dead than it is, or it's worse off to be autistic than it is to be dead. And it's horrible. I mean, you do internalize it. I mean, Jerry's son internalizes it one way. I think about it often in another way. But like now it went from being this outside flamethrower to somebody inside the government who is saying this. And it's I think when you have people who are worried about an autism registry, about what the government is doing and what the government is funding, it's because they are now using a language that is dehumanizing for autistic people.
Mm-hmm.
So let me read Nina. She says, another issue that concerns me is I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner who's been evaluating and treating psychiatric disorders for decades. Of late, I have had numerous requests for autism assessments in my patients and in new referrals. People are very disappointed when I explain that is a specialty area and not part of my training. I was glad to hear your introduction today, identifying that autism requires observation and trained practitioners who have studied the research. So my concern is that we might see a proliferation of practitioners who may add to the confusion by offering new diagnoses to people who might want quicker answers. Can your experts today speak to the diagnostic process? That's from Nina.
Yeah, I can speak to the diagnostic process. So in general, there are a subset of specialists who can diagnose autism. So those are developmental behavioral pediatricians, psychologists, neurologists, psychiatrists for the most part. They have specialized training in what autism is, along with other conditions. And generally, anyone can refer. So a pediatrician, for example, if there's a concern, can refer to a specialist who can go through the process of figuring out whether someone has autism or not. And although it often involves 1 or 2 visits, there's a ton of information that's collected ahead of time so that we can get a really nice kind of larger view of the child, including information from the school, parents, and others who interface with that child.
Do you share Nina's concern that we might see a desire for more quicker answers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that nationally there's a shortage of professionals who are specialized to give an autism diagnosis, and there are really long wait lists. I think, in addition, a lot of people now make their healthcare decisions based on what they see on social media and TikTok. And there's a lot of information that hasn't necessarily been vetted. So people have concerns where they might not have before. I would hope that people will practice within their scope of practice and say just what your caller said, which is, I recognize your concern, but this isn't within my scope of practice. Let me help you find someone.
Mm-hmm. I want to endorse Jerry's idea of bringing RFK here. We should interview him right here.
Yeah.
What would you ask him?
Oh, I guess I would ask him why he has such a hard time with perspective taking. And I would ask that from anyone who is determined to be right rather than, working towards, creating a way forward. I think your point about Prime Minister Carney's comments earlier this week is well taken, because that should not be a minority opinion. That should not be so extraordinary that we're remarking on it now. That humility, that willingness to evolve and follow science or follow, whatever you need to change your mind. We've gotten the idea over the past probably 20 some odd years that changing your mind is a bad thing.
Right.
And so I would want to say, like, what is your concern and how can we talk through this?
Let's do that together.
Let's do it. That'd be great.
Give him an award. That'll get him here.
RFK Jr. is invited. You're all welcome to join us. Let's have a round table, and let's try to do it, I think, respectfully. We're going to put that request out. All they can say is no. But I want to thank our guests for being here. By the way, it's not just Mark Carney that Canada's doing, like his humility that I think Canada as well. Pierre Poilievre, 3 months ago, was going to be the prime minister. He loses. He was pure class on election night, if you watch his speech. Pure class. Way to go, Canada. Good week for Canada. Thank you, Jerry Lynn Sparks. Great seeing you.
Thank you for having me.
Dylan Daler, thanks for sharing your story.
Good to see you again.
Dr. Silverman, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And great working with you, Sarah.
You as well, Evan.
Thank you very much from all of us at WXXI. Have a lovely weekend. We're back with you Monday on member-supported public media.
This program is a production of WXXI Public Radio. The views expressed do not necessarily represent those of this station, its staff, management, or underwriters. The broadcast is meant for the private use of our audience. Any rebroadcast or use in another medium without expressed written consent of WXXI is strictly prohibited. Connections with Evan Dawson is available as a podcast. Just click on the Connections link at WXXInews.org.